Welcome to this video, which is one of our series of informational videos to better explain how the global fertilizer market functions and to look at the Southern African fertilizer market in more detail. The purpose of this particular video is to give South African farmers the following insight. The history of fertilizer production and supply into Southern Africa, and to highlight the trend of import growth since 2000. Also showing where fertilizer is imported and how it's distributed through the region, and introduce some of the logistical challenges that this creates. We'll look at the counter-cyclical planting season versus the Northern Hemisphere. We'll discuss different fertilizer forms and how they're used in Southern Africa. We'll then look at some of the trends, how things are changing in South Africa, and how this may create opportunities and also risks for the Southern African grower. We'll then reflect on the need to change in order to significantly reduce input costs for the grower. If you have not done so already, please also have a look at our videos that we've prepared on nitrogen, phosphates, and potash sectors, as well as an introduction to our company. We would love to hear from you with any questions or comments that you may have. So when we look at the history of production capacity in the sub-Saharan African region, we see that we go back a very long way. Our fertilizer production dates back to the early 1920s in South Africa, where phosphates were produced at Mbogantwini near Durban, using sulfuric acid to process animal bones. We also had the production of explosives in the Cape for the Kimberley diamond mine in the early 1900s, being the reason behind capacity development near Milnerton and also in Somerset West. An ammonia plant was in fact built in the 1960s at Milnerton to feed both fertilizer and explosive production facilities. All of the Milnerton plants were closed around the year 2000 because the plants were too old and small scale to justify the ongoing maintenance costs. Similarly, AECI closed its ammonia urea facility at Modderfontein in 2000. This ended South Africa's time as a urea producer, and the whole region has been 100% reliant on urea imports since that point. The Modderfontein ammonia, ammonium nitrate, and urea facility had originally been built in the 1950s. Sasol currently has two ammonia plants, one at Sasolburg and the other at Secunda, and these plants supply AEL and Omnia for their explosives and fertilizer businesses, as well as Sasol producing its own LAN. The balance of South Africa's ammonia requirements are imported through Richards Bay for Phoscor and Omnia mostly. Kynoch used to have a plant just outside Potchefstroom, which was built in 1967, and that plant closed in 2005, again for economic reasons. When we look to our north, we see that Zimbabwe had the Sable ammonia plant near Kariba that used hydroelectric power from the dam to produce ammonia and ammonium nitrate explosives and fertilizers. Zambia still has the NCZ facility at Kafue, just north of the Zambezi River, that is an NPK producer. So that summarizes the production base for the region. So once upon a time, a number of plants, and today, relatively few plants that are in continuous production. So as we've seen, the decline in local production for various reasons saw the rise of imports into the region. Here we have a map with the major import ports, and the circles show the main grain producing areas within firstly South Africa, which is the dotted circle, and then the bigger circle is the South African plus Zim and Zam grain regions. What is apparent is that the main farming areas are quite distant from the ports. This makes planning critical to optimize the timing of product flow through the ports and also to minimize transport costs to these growing regions. The sub-Saharan African region has long been an ammonium nitrate-based market and a user of chemical compound NPKs. Just a reminder that a chemical compound NPK is a granular fertilizer that contains all three nutrients in a single granule, whereas a bulk blend is made up of the three distinct granules of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and then mixed together in a loose blend. The reason for the ammonium nitrate focus historically was partly due to the availability of ammonium nitrate as a consequence of the need for explosives in the mining sector, and also the agronomic benefits of ammonium nitrate. Around 20 years ago, the security concerns over the storage and handling of ammonium nitrate, as well as the rise of terrorism globally, added to the higher production cost of ammonium nitrate and lower nutrient density, meant that ammonium nitrate usage for agriculture has declined dramatically. Most regions now use urea as their nitrogen source, and they've rather looked at additives to improve the agronomic efficiency of urea in line with ammonium nitrate. In our region, the phosphate supply for many years has come from Phoscor with its Palabora mine, as well as Zimphos, which is at the northern end of the same phosphate deposit. In recent years, Phoscor's inability to produce and supply the domestic market has seen a marked rise in phosphate imports. Potash has always been imported as there are no potash deposits in the region. A somewhat unusual practice in our region compared to the rest of the world is the predominance of a liquid fertilizer market. Liquid fertilizers are simply a blend of N, P, and K that is dissolved in water. This makes the nutrient concentration of a liquid fertilizer quite low in comparison to dry or granular fertilizers, and thus expensive to transport on a cost per nutrient basis. While liquid fertilizers are used in other regions, they tend to be quite specialized, and we do not see liquid fertilizers making up such a large proportion of the overall fertilizer mix compared to South Africa. This is significant because a big challenge in the production of liquid fertilizers has been the supply of phosphates. Currently, the only practical source of phosphates for liquids is phos acid as a raw material. Phosphoric acid comes from Phoscor, which has struggled with timely supply to the market in recent years. Or this phos acid can be imported, which is incredibly expensive because of the specialized ships that are required and also dedicated storage tanks. Phos acid has the unusual dynamic of being a more expensive source of phosphate on a unit of P basis than the final products of MAP or DAP. There are very few large storage facilities for liquids in our region, so building liquid inventory ahead of season is only possible to a limited extent. The market therefore relies on the instantaneous production of liquids, and with the challenges and costs associated with the phosphoric acid raw material, liquid supply in season is often problematic. In the graphic, we have summarized some of the differences and benefits of the different forms of fertilizers used in this region. The straight products, i.e. single nutrient products, and bulk blends that are made from those straights are the lowest cost per nutrient and are the most concentrated forms of fertilizer, which means that they are cheaper to transport and cheaper to apply over compound NPKs and over liquids. Liquids are the cheapest to handle, but their low nutrient concentration means that transport costs are a consideration. Bearing all of this in mind, it is easy to see why the usage of imported high nutrient analysis, straight products, and bulk blends have grown so rapidly in the last decade. I'd now like to look at some of the mega trends in our region. We see that large farming operations are getting bigger. Economies of scale in the overall farming operation has seen the acquisition and consolidation of smaller, sometimes marginal farms into bigger farming businesses. These bigger operations are able to better benefit from some of the latest technologies. We also see a more commercial approach to the sourcing of inputs and also the selling of the produce from these mega farms. A consequence of all of this is that there is diminishing yield improvement from fertilizer and agronomic service alone. In other words, these commercial farms have reached close to the maximum efficiency of just fertilizer nutrient application. A worrying trend is that on average, a grower in sub-Saharan Africa pays about double for his nutrient per hectare compared with his peers in North America or Brazil, as examples. Crop values are largely similar across the regions for commodity grains and so on. This means that the sub-Saharan African grower either makes a lower margin or he applies less nutrient per hectare. Both of these are negatives for sustainability, and as an industry, we urgently need to solve this. Another megatrend in our region is the change in climate, particularly the later and later rain that we see. The timing of planting has thus become later. This brings increased risk of frost to crops that are still in the growth phase due to late planting. From a fertilizer perspective, late planting often means that there's a mad scramble from growers trying to source product in a very short space of time. The net result is local shortages and the local price escalating way above the international price parity point. The next megatrend that is a risk is infrastructure throughout the region. For example, rail networks are close to collapse, and these days very few agricultural inputs or outputs move via this mode. The demise of rail has pushed all bulk products onto roads, with the predictable consequence of road networks now falling into disrepair, and congestion becoming a bigger and bigger issue. The ports are also a point of congestion, whether because of a build-up of ships waiting to enter the ports and discharge, or whether due to trucks that are moving the product from the port to the interior, being congested on small roads around the ports. The flow of fertilizer raw materials and fertilizer finished goods is thus extremely vulnerable to the infrastructure flag. Another trend is that of government support for small-scale or emerging farmers. From a fertilizer perspective, this often means tenders for the aggregated fertilizer requirements of these groups of farmers. For reasons of simplicity, the focus is usually on a few basic fertilizer grades and therefore a rather crude match to the real agronomic requirements. Unfortunately, this is one of the reasons that yields for emerging farmers is lower than it should be. There are some conclusions to be drawn here. There are major risks posed to the grower with these megatrends. The availability of fertilizer when he needs it, plus the increased costs associated with transport, means that the transfer of agricultural inputs to farm needs to be as efficient as possible. So we see how the risk profile for the South African farmer has changed as the fertilizer market has evolved from local production to the majority being imported. This change has happened over the last 20 years. The question is whether the Southern African farmer has taken cognizance of these changes, and if so, has made the necessary changes to his fertilizer buying practices to manage his risks. As this table shows, there are quite different risk parameters for imported or finished fertilizers compared to local production. Local production has a high proportion of South Africa-specific risks, such as inflation, which applies to steam and electricity as well as transport, local labor issues with salary inflation much higher than the global average, and also the skills drain. Local producers must operate year-round, which requires them to build a lot of stock for the season. This creates risk to the international price, as well as the cost of increased working capital tied up in these stocks. Imported product, on the other hand, has the benefits of minimal exposure to these local issues, such as industrial action or load shedding. It does, however, require deep-sea shipping to a Southern African port and discharging at that port. So the reliability of port infrastructure is a risk here. On the flip side, availability of product is never an issue with international product, and the quality coming from new world-scale capacity is also top class. I'd now like to look at the need to change to take advantage of opportunities. The challenges posed by declining local production in favor of imported fertilizer, and thus growers having to change the types or grades of fertilizer that they use, is not unique to sub-Saharan Africa. We have seen this evolution in a number of regions around the world, where local production is closed and has been replaced by imported product. What does need to change is the grower's appreciation of his importance in the overall food production value chain. In other regions, we have seen how the farm produce off-takers, such as processors or even supermarkets, collaborate with growers to determine what crops and even what varietals are required. Similarly, growers in those regions are collaborating with their input suppliers to better plan their supply of inputs. In sub-Saharan Africa, all of these links in the value chain are very fragmented, and the grower is usually involved quite late in the input buying process, which we believe is at the root of our relatively high-cost agriculture when compared to other regions. The exciting part of this is that it creates a fantastic opportunity to make a step change in farming profitability. Yes, it does require a change in the current value chain. The willing adopters that make the change will benefit hugely from reduced costs to their farming operation, as well as reduced risk in a number of areas. We believe that risk should be managed at the most appropriate points in the value chain to minimize cost, and not managed by everybody and just passed on to the next guy in the chain. All of this does require a change in mindset. A quick example of the opportunity to reduce the fertilizer purchase price is by focusing on the time of buying. The smaller fertilizer demand of the southern hemisphere compared to the north means that during the low demand periods of the northern hemisphere, global fertilizer prices are usually at the lowest in the annual cycle. This presents an opportunity for a region such as ours to focus its buying at this time and buy fertilizers at their low point. So we see that a simple change in mindset where we consider buying earlier means that we can save quite a bit on the cost of fertilizer at an import parity level. The fundamental question here is how can the grower in sub-Saharan Africa take advantage of this trend to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of his overall operation to become more profitable and thus more sustainable. This is what we at F-Curve Agri wish to explore with growers who are ready to start this journey. To summarize this discussion, we have seen how sub-Saharan Africa once had a widespread local production base, and this has shrunk over time as imports have displaced these local plants. We have mentioned how fertilizer preferences and usage patterns are slowly changing. It is worth evaluating your current practices to understand what the cost-benefit opportunities might be, and to consider your longer-term application practices in terms of both risk and opportunity to save cost. Imported product volumes continue to grow and offer a number of benefits to the grower in terms of the cost of nutrient, the efficiency of supply to farm, and to reduce the grower's exposure to local risks that result in cost. The grower must play a central role in the agricultural value chain, and it is in the industry's interest that the various role players collaborate even more closely. The grower needs to be involved in the planning discussion as early as possible. We'd love to hear from you if any of these opportunities resonate with you. We can help you with the implementation of these steps to better input supply. At F-Curve Agri, we can do an analysis of your current fertilizer practices and help you identify cost-saving opportunities. I hope you enjoyed this video. A reminder to look at our other videos that look at nitrogen, phosphates and potash if you have not done so already. There is also a video introducing F-Curve Agri and what we do. Thank you for your interest, and we look forward to hearing from you.